Are you studying for your APUSH midterm? Well, here's first semester in just 15 minutes.
That's right, we're studying from period 1 in those pre-Columbian Native societies through Reconstruction at the end of period 5.
So grab a notebook and a pen, take some notes so you can crush that test.
Period 1 focuses on the exchanges and conflicts that occurred when Native Americans, Europeans, and Africans came into contact in the Americas for the first time. Before Columbus arrived, Native American societies were extremely diverse. The Pueblo people, who were located in the Southwest, built permanent villages and complex irrigation systems in the desert. Tribes located on the Great Plains were nomadic buffalo hunters. In the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast formed powerful political alliances and practiced agriculture. And geography often determined lifestyle and culture for indigenous groups.
When Europeans arrived, the Columbian Exchange transformed both the Old World and the New. Crops like corn and potatoes traveled to Europe, while horses, pigs, sugar, and deadly diseases like smallpox came to the Americas. The impact on indigenous populations was catastrophic. Diseases decimated up to 90% of some native communities, destroying societies and paving the way for European conquest. On the other hand, Europe experienced a period of extreme population growth due to new food staples like the potato. This also led to the development of the Atlantic slave trade. Europeans transported enslaved Africans to work on plantations in the Caribbean and then later in the Americas, creating a brutal system that transformed global societies and economies.
The Spanish established colonies using what was called the encomienda system, which was a labor system that forced Native Americans to work for Spanish settlers. The Spanish justified this system by claiming it benefited Native peoples, saying they were offering protection and the Christian faith in return. This sparked moral debates in Spain, especially those that took place between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Inés de Sepúlveda. Las Casas argued that indigenous people were rational beings who deserved fair treatment and conversion through persuasion. But Sepúlveda claimed that Native Americans were inferior and were better off being controlled by the Spanish. These debates reflected early conflicts over human rights and colonization. But despite Spanish oppression, Native resistance was strong. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, led by Pope, temporarily drove the Spanish out of New Mexico, demonstrating that indigenous people actively resisted European domination.
Now here's a test it to prepare for questions from period 1. Focus on the impact of geography on regional diversity, the effects of the Columbian Exchange, and how the Spanish attempted to justify colonization.
Period 2 begins with the founding of Jamestown and ends right before the French and Indian War. But before we talk about English colonization, it's important to talk about the competition between European powers for control of the Americas. The Spanish focused on extracting wealth and controlling Native Americans through forced conversion. They also set up missions for Catholic conversion. Their colonies were tightly controlled by their crown and built on the encomienda system and the later asiento system. The French established trade networks along waterways where they focused on the fur trade. They also formed relatively cooperative relationships with Native Americans through alliances. Now, the Dutch, who were centered in New Amsterdam, focused on commerce and trade rather than conquest, though they were pretty small in number. They also had pretty friendly relationships with Native Americans and diversity amongst their settlers. And last, we have the English, who settled in families to create large colonies with permanent towns. This led to more displacement of natives as population growth increased the demand for land. So while all four of these European powers sought wealth and empire, their relationships with indigenous people, their motives for settlement, and their systems of governance differ dramatically.
Now let's talk about the English colonies, where regional differences developed quickly. In New England, colonists came primarily for religious reasons. The Puritans hoped to build a city upon a hill. Their communities revolved around small towns, family farms, and trade. Now the middle colonies, such as Pennsylvania and New York, were more diverse and tolerant. They produced grain, traded actively, and had a mix of cultures and religions. And the southern colonies developed plantation agriculture, growing cash crops like tobacco and rice. Over time, they came to rely more heavily on enslaved African labor, especially after Bacon's Rebellion revealed the instability of relying on indentured servants. Now, because the colonies experienced a long period of salutary neglect, they were able to establish early forms of self-government. Colonial governments were essential for the development of the British colonies like the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Massachusetts General Assembly. And foundational agreements like the Mayflower Compact and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut helped outline basic principles of governing. And finally, we have the First Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s, which encouraged emotional preaching and challenged established authority. It promoted ideas of equality and individual choice that foreshadowed revolutionary thinking.
Now, here's a test tip. Be ready to compare these colonial regions. Now, when you're studying, make sure that you focus on motives for settlement, labor systems, and the impact of geography.
So period 3 begins with the French and Indian War and ends with the early years of the United States. The French and Indian War, fought between the British and the French over the fertile Ohio River Valley, left the British victorious but also deeply in debt. Britain imposed new taxes and restrictions like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. They also passed the Proclamation of 1763, which banned colonial settlement west of the Appalachians. Colonists viewed these as violations of their rights, fueling protests and resentment. This led to the formation of groups like the Committees of Correspondence, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and the Continental Congress. Rebellions like the Boston Tea Party and Britain's harsh reaction through the Intolerable Acts pushed colonists further towards independence. Influential writings like Thomas Paine's Common Sense argue that monarchy was incompatible with liberty and helped convince Americans to declare independence.
The Declaration of Independence, which was written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, expressed Enlightenment ideals like natural rights and the idea of consent of the governed. During the Revolutionary War, patriots fought to secure independence, but loyalists who feared instability and economic loss remained loyal to the British Crown. The Battle of Saratoga was a major turning point in the American Revolution because it convinced France to offer vital military and economic support. And the winter at Valley Forge tested Washington's Continental Army, but the training and discipline instilled there strengthened the Patriot forces. And after several more years of fighting, the war finally ended at Yorktown in 1781, when British General Cornwallis surrendered to Washington's troops, effectively ensuring American independence. After declaring independence, the Continental Congress established the first national government under the Articles of Confederation. But they were too weak to govern effectively. Congress couldn't tax, it couldn't regulate trade, or enforce laws. And the economic instability and social unrest that followed created serious concerns amongst national leaders. Shays' Rebellion in 1786, when Massachusetts farmers rose up against taxes and foreclosures, convinced many of them that the nation needed a stronger central government. And that rebellion became the final straw that led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787.
The Constitution created a stronger federal system with separation of powers and checks and balances, and several major compromises made this possible. The Great Compromise balanced large and small states by creating a bicameral Congress, one house based on population and the other giving each state equal representation. The Three-Fifths Compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation. And the Commercial Compromise allowed Congress to regulate interstate and foreign trade, but prohibited them from banning the international slave trade for 20 years. Now, once the Constitution was completed, it was sent to the states to be ratified, and these debates over ratification created two political camps. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, supported a strong central government, but the Anti-Federalists feared centralized power, so they demanded a Bill of Rights to ensure personal liberties were protected.
As the new government formed, George Washington set some key precedents. He created the cabinet, he served only 2 terms, and he emphasized neutrality in key foreign events like the French Revolution. And as he left office, he issued his famous farewell address, which warned against the creation of political parties and foreign entanglements. John Adams, who followed George Washington, faced some challenges due to ongoing tensions with France, like the XYZ affair. He signed the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, which limited free speech and immigration. This sparked backlash, including the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which argued that states could nullify federal laws.
Now let's talk study tips. When you're studying for period 3, always connect cause and effect. Think about how the French and Indian War led to increased British debt. This led to the end of salutary neglect and those new taxes. These caused the colonial protests and eventually the American Revolution. Independence led to the Articles of Confederation, then led to the Constitution, which led to the election of George Washington. And if you can make these links in an APUSH essay, you're golden.
Period 4 covers expansion of democracy, the growth of industry, and reform movements that transformed American society. The election of 1800 marked the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties. This is known as the Revolution of 1800. And as president, Thomas Jefferson sought to reduce federal power and the national debt. However, he still made the bold Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubled the size of the U.S. but contradicted his strict constitutional views. And later, the Embargo Act of 1807, which was meant to protect American shipping during European wars, actually backfired and hurt American trade. And tensions with Britain continued under President James Madison, mainly due to impressment of American sailors, continued trade interference, and support for Native American resistance in the Northwest Territories. These causes led to the War of 1812, which included the burning of Washington, D.C., the creation of the Star-Spangled Banner, and the rise of war hero Andrew Jackson. The war ended with the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, but inspired a period of national unity and pride known as the Era of Good Feelings during James Monroe's presidency.
And it was during this time where Henry Clay's American system promoted national economic growth through protective tariffs, a national bank, and internal improvements like roads and canals. Two major developments defined this era: the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which maintained the balance between free and slave states, and the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which warned European nations not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. The American economy was also transformed during this period with the market revolution. In the North, factories and textile mills expanded manufacturing and drew workers into the cities. In the South, the cotton gin increased cotton production, which deepened the South's dependence upon slavery. In the West, mechanized agriculture and new transportation systems connected farmers to markets nationwide. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson's presidency symbolized the rise of the common man with the expansion of white male suffrage. Jackson implemented the spoils system, opposed the National Bank, and supported the Indian Removal Act, which later led to the tragic Trail of Tears.
The Second Great Awakening inspired reform movements that were aimed at improving American society in the 1830s and 1840s. And the abolition movement grew quickly and was led by voices across the country. William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, Frederick Douglass spoke from his experience as a formerly enslaved person, and the Grimke sisters condemned both slavery and gender inequality. And the women's rights movement gained strength as well, culminating in the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. This is where women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott demanded suffrage and equality.
Other reformers pushed for changes across society. Horace Mann worked to expand and improve public education, and Dorothea Dix fought to transform prisons and mental health facilities, while another reform movement called Temperance sought to limit alcohol use to strengthen families and communities. Together, these reform movements reflect an increased effort to address inequality and improve society in the early 19th century.
And here's a test tip. As you're studying period 4, think about how you can connect economic change, political change, and social change. For example, the market revolution, which is mostly economic, fueled reform and transformed democracy.
And finally, we have period 5, which focuses on territorial expansion, debates over slavery, and division of the nation. The belief in manifest destiny, popularized by journalist John O. Sullivan, claimed that Americans were destined by God to expand westward across the continent. President James K. Polk embraced this vision, overseeing the annexation of Texas, the Oregon boundary settlement, and the Mexican-American War. And the resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added vast territories to the United States.
This expansion heightened debates over slavery and if it would spread into the territories. By this time, slavery was entrenched in the South due to the growth of cotton production and the domestic slave trade. It wasn't just vital to the Southern economy, but was the basis of political power and social status. And the North's growing abolitionist movement, in contrast to the South's argument that slavery was a positive good, deepened the sectional divide. The Wilmot Proviso, although it never passed, proposed banning slavery in all of the territories that were won in the war with Mexico. Its introduction really signaled the beginning of open political conflict over the future of slavery in the United States. And the Compromise of 1850 temporarily eased tensions by admitting California as a free state and allowing popular sovereignty for Utah and New Mexico. But it strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, which appeased Southerners but angered Northern abolitionists.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers to decide on the question of slavery by popular sovereignty, but led to the violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. This ultimately led to the formation of the Republican Party, who opposed the spread of slavery. And the 1857 Dred Scott v. Sanford decision ruled that African Americans were not citizens and that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories, effectively nullifying earlier compromises. These challenges culminated with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Lincoln's victory prompted Southern secession and the outbreak of the Civil War. During the war, Lincoln took bold measures to preserve the Union and maintain loyalty in the border states, including the suspension of habeas corpus. But Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation reframed the Union's cause to include ending slavery, which gave the war a moral purpose. Although the war raged on for 4 years, the Union's industrial strength, transportation networks, and leadership helped it prevail over the Confederacy.
After the war, Reconstruction brought constitutional and social change. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th Amendment secured voting rights for African American men, while the Freedmen's Bureau helped newly freed African Americans transition by providing them food, clothing, medical care, and even access to educational opportunities. Despite Despite these gains, Black codes, sharecropping, and racial violence limited freedom and equality. And Reconstruction abruptly ended with the Compromise of 1877 and the election of Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes. In exchange, federal troops were removed from the South, which marked the end of federal support for the enforcement of civil rights.
When you're studying for Period 5, focus on continuity and change over time. How did expansion and war reshape ideas about freedom and federal power?
Let's wrap up with a few quick study reminders. First is think thematically. Look for connections in politics, economics, culture, and geography across time periods.
Next, understand causes and consequences. Don't just memorize, explain why things happened.
Third, in your writing, use outside evidence. Specific names and events strengthen your essays and your SAQs.
For multiple choice, look for key phrases like most directly or primary cause.
For SAQs, answer all parts with a clear claim and specific evidence.
And for a DBQ, use at least 5 documents, add outside evidence, and tie everything back to your thesis.
So remember that the story of America is a story of conflict, compromise, and change. Keep reviewing, connect ideas across time periods, and think like a historian.
So good luck on your APUSH midterm. Now you're ready to crush it.